Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Bodhi Tree Buddhism for class number 5 on our series on Buddhist psychology. So good to see you all here with us this morning or this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are. And if you're tuning in to the live stream on Facebook, please just drop a little message there to let us all know that you're with us today. Now, as we begin, we're just going to do our 3 invocations to the Buddha to start off. I know I've missed it in a couple of classes, but now that I've remembered, let's do it. So we're just going to join our palms together and invoke the name of the Buddha. So Namo Ben Shi Jia Moni Fo, Namo Ben Shi Jia Moni Fo, Namo Ben Shi Jia Moni Fo. So that just means like respect to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha. So Shakyamuni Buddha being one of the names for what we sometimes refer to as the historical Buddha. And it's always good to remind ourselves at the start of a class or any kind of study or practice that we're doing that the teachings that we're looking at do come from the Buddha himself, though they've passed for a couple of thousand years and through many hands. But we're trying to, as close as we can and as close as possible, really understand what the Buddha himself taught. So today we are going to be looking at the meditative mind. So we're going to be talking a little bit about meditation, some different terms for meditation, and some of the different, what we might call the mental factors or the elements that make up meditation. And that also includes which mental states or mental factors or elements are actually obstructions to meditation. Now, throughout the whole of today's class, the topic of meditation, is a pretty huge one. You could do whole huge books about just one single meditation practice, let alone kind of Buddhist meditation as a whole. So we're going to talk about some of the basics, some of the essentials. And then, of course, we're still going to have some time. Hopefully at the end we can maybe discuss some more specific ideas or some ideas that might be specific to Buddhist psychology, in particular traditions of meditation or techniques of meditation. So that's what we've got lined up for you today. I see we've already got a couple of people tuning in here. We've got Eric there. Good morning. We've got Jay Lee. Good morning too. Alexander. Mei Fang. Good to see you as well. Venerable Rukai and Hanuman. Good to see you all. Okay, a lot of people tuning in this morning. That's good to see. Wherever you're tuning in from, I hope things are going well for you. I hope you're staying safe, protecting yourself, protecting the people around you in these troubled times, shall we say. And it's great that you've got the time at least this morning, afternoon, evening to manage to tune into the classes. Okay, what should I do now? I've got to flip over. Let me flip. I got to flip to our PowerPoint. Now, I will warn you, today's PowerPoint's a little bit kind of boring, kind of more text stuff. But I think there's quite a bit of stuff to cover, and I think a lot of this material is just best presented by having those terms and key ideas up on the PowerPoint and you can see it. Okay, there we are. Okay, Buddhist Psychology, Class 5, that's us today. Little reminder, as usual, of what we've done. And this is also a bit of a reminder for those who are not, who may be tuning into this class for the first time. So if you're interested in these other topics, you can go back and Facebook, or maybe later some people will be watching this from YouTube, and look at some of the earlier classes that we've had in this course series so far. Body and mind and the 5 aggregates, really important Buddhist system for analyzing who we are as people. The 5 kind of essential constituents. The process of sense perception and how we perceive the world, and kind of this relationship between, say, ourselves as subjective perceivers or cognizers, subjective minds, and then also the objective world out there, so things other than ourselves as objects of the senses. Then we looked at emotions and views, which are two basic categories of the afflictions, and why looking at afflictions is important for Buddhism, because those are the causes of dukkha, dissatisfaction, or sometimes translated as suffering. And last week we looked at the storehouse consciousness, an important concept, particularly for Yogacara Buddhism, and for the East Asian traditions at least. Even though often people will talk about, there's a particular school of East Asian Buddhism that usually gets called Wei Shi or Fa Xiang, so mind only or consciousness only, or the characteristics of Dharma's school. But this idea of, and that school is, spends a lot of time talking about storehouse consciousness because the school focuses on these Yogacara teachings. But really, almost all of East Asian Buddhism does use this concept of the storehouse consciousness. And how that's important because when we're talking about that earlier topic of like sense perception and just perceiving the world, it's kind of like live, my perceptions right now, they're live perceptions. But then we also have this issue of a lot of other material that comes up that's kind of like stimulated or provoked by different experiences or different perceptions. When I have memories of things, when I have emotions that come up due to seeing something or hearing something, for example, what's that all about? And so the storehouse consciousness was an important way of trying to explain that. And it was also important for talking about how do our actions, so our karmas, our actions that we do in past lifetimes or earlier in this lifetime, how does that then go on into the future? Again, be it in the future of this lifetime or future lifetimes. How do Buddhists explain that karma is not lost? When we have these actions, they will lead to some kind of result. But at the same time, Buddhists also talk about having multiple lifetimes without any kind of like permanent unchanging soul. And so the storehouse consciousness was an important concept there as well. Okay, so that was stuff we have covered so far. And today we are on to the meditative mind. And next week we will be looking at the liberated mind. Okay, that's the idea at least anyway. Okay, so we've got a couple more people tuning in. GW there, and of course Terry. Good to see you, Terry. I see you. See you've got a lot of. I don't know. Is it me? Is it just my Facebook feed? It seems you've got a lot more classes and activities that you've got on in the Kalyana group there lately, and that's good to see. I hope those are all going well for you, and that shows that like you're getting a lot of interest, and what you're doing is obviously valuable for people. It's what people want. So that's really cool to see. And great that you can still join us today. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so today, the meditative mind. Okay. Now, I'm labeling, these classes, I'm giving them English names. We talk about perception, talk about body and mind. We talked about, storehouse consciousness, or maybe we want to call it like the subconscious mind. And so likewise today, we're talking about meditation, but got to keep in mind, when we're talking about meditation, I mean, this is an English language term. And I think for those people that spend, they're quite keen to learn a lot about Buddhism, if we don't come from cultures and languages that have their own very well established native Buddhist traditions. So in other words, if we're not saying a native Chinese speaker or Japanese speaker or Tibetan speaker, and we're using some other language like English, after a while we might learn that like, there's all these other technical words for these ideas that we're talking about. And at least for myself, I think this is important to kind of be aware of that. I mean, one big example that where I find that this is potentially a problem, this is the point that I'm getting at here, is that lately, in the last, I don't know, it's been building up more and more. The last few years, 10 years, 20 years ago, there was a little bit of it. So academic studies on meditation from a psychology point of view. So, somebody who's a PhD in psychology, might be cognitive psychology or something like this. They want to understand the effects of meditation. And so they go and they do some study. They use some particular meditation technique. But when they're making the conclusions for their study, they might come to conclusions like, Buddhist meditation leads to such and such a result. Buddhist meditation leads to such and such a result. And so people then think, meditation, like any kind of meditation is going to lead to this result. But it overlooks the fact that there are lots of different types of meditation, and they don't all necessarily lead to the same result. I mean, it's a bit like people saying things like, people just overgeneralization. And overgeneralization can lead to all sorts of confusion. People overgeneralizing about religions, overgeneralizing about, different ethnicities, for example, creates all kind of like bigotry and confusion. So what I want to do first of all is just talk about, we've got this term, and so let's be a little bit clearer than just meditation, right? So the English term meditation, it's so broad and so vague. It's slightly better than like 100 years ago when Buddhist material was being translated into English, and it was fairly rudimentary. Some of these meditative states, they translated them in words like trance. I don't know. It makes me think like somebody like, with the old hypnotist's pocket watch. Your eyes are getting very heavy. You are falling into a deep sleep. And that's a trance. And then, Buddhists practice trance states. It's either that or like, like dance parties. Used to call like trance parties. Big problems. Or what are some of the other old terms they used to use? Well, like even early on when, say early 20th century, when people in English language speakers in the West were trying to understand what meditation was, and they were using categories from people like Freud, and some people were saying like, meditation seems very similar to catatonia. I mean, catatonia is this kind of like just completely like unconscious, almost like comatose sort of a state, and they thought that's what it was. So the terms that we use to describe these things are important, and we need to be aware of that so that we can avoid confusion and misunderstanding. So some other terms, so I'm just going to use some terms from Sanskrit or maybe Pali and a bit of Chinese. So one of the most important ones is the term samadhi. In Chinese, that's transliterated. These first two characters here, san mei, samadhi, right? You kind of see they tried to like phoneticize it. Or this term here, ding, is probably the most general term, and it's probably the most common term. And also keep in mind that the term samadhi wasn't just used in Buddhism; it was also used in Hindu traditions. If you look into yoga, for example, so in the eight limbs of yoga, which is kind of like 8 stages or steps of further development. The eighth one, the 8th stage, the kind of culminating stage of the yoga practice, was also termed samadhi. Now, Hindu use and meaning and Buddhist use and meaning are a little bit different, but they've basically got a similar sense of samadhi, focusing the mind on one thing. Another really important term is in Sanskrit, dhyana. In Pali, this is pronounced jhana. And in Chinese, this was, early on it was transliterated, chana. Probably when it first came into China, it wasn't this proper Sanskrit term. It was a term that probably sounded something like jhana, chana. And later on for the Chinese, they kind of dropped out the second character. And this first character here, I hope you can see that little pointer on the screen. That first character there after dhyana, which is pronounced Chan, is the same Chan as in like the Chan school of Buddhism, Chan meditation, and Zen. It goes to Japan and becomes Zen. And so it's kind of funny. People often talk about Chan meditation. So meditation, kind of like it's a bit strange. Of course, now a really important point here is this term dhyana, very early Buddhist term, and that referred to some more kind of specific forms or specific states of concentration. We'll get into that in a second. But as it develops into the Chan school, it really does kind of take on a bit of a different meaning. So you have to be a bit careful with this term Chan if it's been used in an earlier sense, where it basically equals this Sanskrit term, Pali term, or if it's been used later in the Chan school, and then it has some other different senses going on. So these are two of the probably biggest terms. Now there's another term I'm going to add here, which is Smriti, in Chinese Nian. In Pali this is Sati, and that is mindfulness, right? We've encountered this term before. We did it in our last course, mindfulness meditation. And again, for most general Buddhist traditions, this mindfulness is kind of a precursor to the above two. So I'll give like one example of why I say it's a precursor. It's like precursor meaning like it's something that you do and develop, and then as that develops strong enough, it becomes samadhi and perhaps some form of dhyana. Is if we look at the Eightfold Path, right? So think of the Eightfold Path. You all know the Eightfold Path, right? So right view, right intention, etc., etc. Last two of the eight, right mindfulness, and we usually say right meditation. So the right meditation is samyak samadhi, so correct samadhi, but the one before that is correct smriti, so correct mindfulness. And the way I like to talk about them is when used in the sense of the Eightfold Path, mindfulness is constantly establishing and re-establishing the mind on a given topic or on a different object of focus. And when that becomes strong enough, when it's not just kind of like, you focus on something and then your mind wanders off and you bring it back and focuses and it wanders off again. But when the mind is just constantly on that object, it's not wandering off at all, it's there, it's sustained, then we can start to talk about samadhi proper. There's a concentration and not just mindfulness, right? So now there's many other terms we can talk about, many others. I can fill literally several PowerPoint pages just with the terms and the terminology, but let's just leave it for now. 3 is already enough. Samadhi, dhyana, and smriti. And key point here, let's just in particular focus on this first term, samadhi, and look at it in terms of being a mind which is fixed on a single object. So the mind which is fixed on a certain object, on a single object. So a couple of key points. One is a single object, right? So it's on that, it's not bouncing around between different things, and it's fixed. It's there for a sustained ongoing period of time. Now we can have this kind of samadhi without necessarily being like in some deep meditative state, right? I mean, in a way, and just you have to be a bit careful about this usage, in a way, if you're like listening to some music and you're just focusing on that, it is a kind of basic concentration. Okay, now samadhi, as I said, doesn't equal dhyana. Concentration, okay, it needs to get to an even more intense level and on particular objects before we can talk about being dhyana. But let's just talk about, first of all, samadhi, focus and concentration of the mind on a single object, and it's sustained and maintained there for kind of a period of time, shall we say. Okay, how are we going so far? Let me bounce back and okay, so Mario has joined us. Good to see you. And Alex says yes, the mouse is visible. Okay, that's cool. So I can use the mouse as like the pointer on the screen to show you what I'm referring to. Okay, now as usual, if you've got any questions, just like throw them out as we go. I will try to bounce back and look at the Facebook page every now and then to check if there's any questions coming through. Okay, so maybe we should talk a bit more about samadhi rather than the term meditation, because like I said, sometimes people can use meditation to refer to mindfulness or some other specific states. And even if we're talking about meditation in a very specific sense of samadhi, and even if we were talking about it in terms of a specific dhyana, very specific state, we'll get to that in a second, even the methods that are used, the different objects, for example, that are focused on, will bring about different effects within the mind. So like I was saying earlier, when people say things like, oh, meditation will lead to such and such a result, ideally we'd want to be more specific. Meditation, focus and concentration on what leads to what kind of state. Meditation focusing on the body, meditation focusing on the breath, meditation focusing on loving kindness, meditation focusing on a visualization of a Buddha or a visualization of a mandala, or meditation which focuses on reciting a mantra. They all might be states of concentration where the mind is fixed on a single object, like just fixed on the body or just on the breath, or just on loving kindness, or just on a mandala, or just on a mantra. But then the results that you get from that can be really very different. So we need to also, like I just been reiterating, set that aside a bit for now. Okay, now this next little diagram here, this is kind of a bit more technical stuff. I just want to talk about this very quickly. So one really interesting thing about the Buddhist description of kind of different levels or different depths or degrees of samadhi also correlates to what we might refer to as the different kinds of realms of existence for different living beings in this world. Now, what do I mean by that? Different meditative states correspond to different realms of existence. So one of the key things, like in Buddhism and the whole idea of rebirth, we are reborn into different forms. I'm a kind of human at the moment, this lifetime, kind of human. And there's different animals and insects and birds and fish, and of course there's other ones as well. Buddhism also talks about different kind of levels of heavenly or divine existence, different levels of gods, and also lower realms, so different sort of disembodied spirits, and also beings whose existence is kind of like in this very hellish, incredibly painful state. Now, why are different beings reborn into different states of existence? It's basically due to their karma, the actions that they have committed. And when we're talking about actions and karma, okay, remember we talked back when the class is talking about process of perception, and we're talking about the afflictions. In that process, our intentional actions, right, those volitional actions or those emotions, right? So the fourth aggregate, called samskaras, is largely comprised of mental karma, right? So remember those emotions and those afflictions, for example, and also those positive states. Love, compassion, generosity, these are also emotions. These are our karmas, which then effectively create who we will be in the future. So then who we are, our kind of state of existence, is directly related to then our mental states and mental qualities. So that's kind of the relationship there. So when we refine the mind and purify the mind, which we can do through the process of meditation, it also brings about more refined and more purified, what we sometimes call higher states of existence. And vice versa, right? So when our minds become coarse and rough and overpowered and overcome by different afflictions, hatred and anger and ignorance and greed and jealousy, etc., it makes the mind, those qualities of the mind, lead to other specific types of rebirth and what we might sometimes call lower states of existence. So that's the relationship. Quality of mind leads to quality of existence. Wholesome states of mind lead to more refined, happy, sometimes called beautiful states of existence. More afflictive states of mind lead to more painful states of existence. So we can kind of line these up, and these are regularly lined up. So here we might start with our regular state of mind. And by regular mind, I just mean regular human state of mind. Okay, there's still quite a bit of variation there, right? And this basically corresponds to what we call the desire realm. So usually our day-to-day existence is in this desire realm. And now that doesn't mean that we're like 24/7 overcome by desires. And maybe just like 23/6 overcome by desire. 23 hours a day, 6 days a week. But, you know, we are often driven by desires. And, you know, not just humans, animals, for example. They're looking for food. They're looking for a mate. They're looking for more food. Desires are the primary drivers. And that leads to different states. General human existence, animal existence, let's say. Now, as the mind then gets refined, say, into first dhyana, and I'm going to, like I said, I'll talk about what constitutes that, or deeper, second, third, fourth dhyana. Pretty original names, huh? Makes it easy to remember, okay? Ever increasingly refined states of mind. These four are known as the form realm. So the form realm means there is like, so this kind of existence means there is a physical form, there is a kind of a physical body, but it's not primarily driven by these kinds of sensual desire. Should have said that earlier. Desire realm really means sensual desire. So pleasures of the senses. And this kind of existence are various forms of gods, for want of a better term, different types of devas. So they do have a kind of an embodiment, but it's a much more refined state. And actually even that kind of form, the physical forms that they take, if we read the scriptures, they kind of seem to give the impression that it's like a body of light. It's like more of a rarefied existence. The further you go towards the desire realm, the more coarse and material it becomes. And then beyond that, there are also other states of mind. So there's even more refined states of mind in order. The state of infinite space, the state of infinite cognition or infinite consciousness, the state of nothing at all. And it's worth pointing out that the state of nothing at all doesn't mean that there is nothing at all. But in that state of mind, remember, these are states of mind, one does not perceive anything at all. One perceives that there is nothing at all. Subtle but very important difference. One perceives that there is nothing at all. Before that, one just perceives, oh, there's only space, and then there's only consciousness. And then one perceives that there is nothing at all. And then beyond that, there's a state of neither perception nor non-perception. Now, the corresponding states of existence, they're also considered like divine or heavenly states, and these are formless. These do not actually have any kind of physical form at all. They're entirely mental. Now, two important points here. One, from the regular mind and then getting more and more refined down to the state here, neither perception nor non-perception, this progress does not correspond to what we might call liberation or attaining nirvana. This is a very, very common misperception. Often people think that, oh, okay, so is this last state like nirvana, or do you then go to like a next state and that's nirvana? It's not like that at all. These are all temporary states, and they're useful for attaining liberation, but they do not correspond to liberation. And it does not mean at all that the higher you are, the more liberated you are, or the closer you are to liberation. Okay. And then this connects us to the second key point. The second key point is actually for Buddhist practice, what we can understand from the sutras, the dhyanas are far more important for liberation than these other formless realms. So classically speaking, so like if we look at the story of the Buddha's own awakening, he goes up into the fourth dhyana, and from the fourth dhyana he then applies wisdom, he generates various types of insights and becomes liberated. Fourth dhyana is kind of like the Buddhist best state of mind to be in, from which to then make the next step and attain liberation. But any of the dhyanas are pretty good. And these higher states here are actually not very useful at all. Now there's a bit of an explanation for this later on, basically saying that in the dhyanas there is a better balance between samadhi and prajna, between calm and focus and insight wisdom. And ideally in the fourth dhyana. But when you go up into these higher ones, infinite space, infinite cognition, nothing at all, neither perception, sorry, that should be nor non-perception, not. These states, the mind is incredibly kind of like calmed and focused on those states, but it's so calm that it's almost impossible to generate a kind of an insight, and you need the insight, the wisdom, to attain liberation. That's why the dhyanas are more important for the actual goal of liberation than just going into these formless states. Okay, all of these, apart from the regular mind, from the first dhyana, second, third, fourth dhyana, etc., all of those are samadhis, but only these four are dhyanas. Okay, now what I've just said about these, kind of like interesting information. Of course, there's always a big question of like, how relevant is this to the regular practitioner? Very good point. Okay, so we're going to take a step back and focus on these dhyanas first of all. Okay, now let me just bounce back, see if anyone's throwing any questions out. Okay, question from Alexander. Just a question about the single object aspect of samadhi in the context of something like anapanasati. Just a second. The Anapanasati Sutta, so mindfulness of breathing sutra, suggests, for instance, breathing in and out with awareness of the whole body and while tranquilizing bodily formations. Yep. But also describes the process as developing concentration as an awakening factor. In this case, do we consider the breath to be the single object or the entire body, or perhaps form? Yet formations are also involved. Okay, I'm not sure about how formations are involved unless you're talking about tranquilizing bodily formations. To me, bodily formations just means the body. There's different interpretations on that. I don't know if you joined us for the mindfulness meditation course, the last course that we did. There's different interpretations on that. But I basically take the so-called bodily formations as the body. So coming back to the main question, keep in mind, of course, that the breath is effectively part of the body. So we could say it is, awareness of the whole body is the whole body. And then the breath is a specific kind of more narrow aspect of the body when during this practice. Okay. Now, a point to keep in mind is this is the Anapanasati Sutta. So this is the mindfulness sutta. It calls it mindfulness. It doesn't call it samadhi. But then later on, it also does talk about developing concentration as an awakening factor. Okay, now, a lot of technical stuff in here. And my basic take on it is this. If you look at the Anapanasati Sutta, so you've got the 16 aspects, for want of a better term, right? So it breaks up Anapanasati into 16, and those 16 are 4 groups of 4. And those 4 groups of 4 in turn basically then correspond to the usual 4 grounds of mindfulness. So it's first using the first group of 4 is then using mindfulness of the breath to develop mindfulness of the body. Then the next set of 4 using mindfulness of the breath to develop mindfulness of feelings or sensations. Then mindfulness of the breath to develop mindfulness of mental states, and then mindfulness of the breath to develop mindfulness of dhammas. And it seems to me, so whether you're using the mindfulness of the breath to develop those 4, or you're just using the regular 4 grounds of mindfulness teachings, so just like if you're just using the Satipatthana, Smrti teachings, you basically got these 4. And now an interesting thing is this. If you look at those 4, so body, feelings, mind, and dharmas, they also correspond to the different depths of entering into samadhi or entering into dhyana. When it's talking about feelings, the sutras themselves don't just talk about feeling. You're not just sitting there going, oh, what feelings do I have? What feelings do I have? The sutra does not describe it like that. It's specifically focusing on a couple of very pleasant feelings. There's joy and happiness. And then likewise, when it's talking about the different states of mind, it's talking about things like the mind, literally the mind gone great or the mind not gone great, the focused mind or the scattered mind. So it's talking about the mind in terms of basically being concentrated or not being concentrated. And it seems to me that then these processes are then overall basically the equivalent of generating samadhi and dhyana. So while the text itself might be called mindfulness, as you really get into it, it is basically the equivalent of dhyana. And so you're starting from the body as a whole, which is a broader object. You're then focusing down into the breath, which is a kind of a slightly smaller subject. But then you're getting into these very specific states of mind, and those states of mind are basically connected to the different factors that are needed for generating dhyana. Now, does it kind of mean mindfulness extends into samadhi and dhyana, or does it mean that the text is called mindfulness, but it kind of just starts from mindfulness and then goes into samadhi and dhyana? Okay, you can debate it either way. But even when we're talking about like a single object, you still need the different factors of samadhi to be in place to assist with that focus in order to bring about that samadhi or that dhyana state. Oh, okay, and then just as about to flip back to the notes, we got another question here from Hanuman. You mentioned there are different types of meditation. Even in Buddhism, there are different practices. Yeah, very much so. Do all these fall under the definition of right samadhi and right mindfulness among these? For example, breath meditation, body awareness, chanting the Buddha's name, etc., which one leads to dhyana states. In general, yes. I don't want to talk about like all types of meditation because there's so much stuff, but in general they do. So breath meditation, for example, this is what we just mentioned. So usually the most common term for that is mindfulness of the breath. And like body awareness, often that again comes in the category of mindfulness of the body. And as I've just said, this is just basically what I just mentioned to Alexander there, to his question, is that you're starting off with mindfulness, but as you're developing and deepening that mindfulness, it becomes full-on concentration, full-on samadhi. Chanting the Buddha's name, in Chinese, the term for that is also nian for. So nian, it originally comes from mindfulness of the Buddha. Though early on, that specific technique, mindfulness of the Buddha, originally had a very different sense. It involved recollecting the Buddha, keeping the Buddha in mind. It might involve chanting the different names of the Buddha. So, for example, like referring to that. So, like in Chinese, Ru Lai In Gong Zheng Pian Zi, etc., etc. So, the Buddha is the thus come one. The Buddha is an arahant. He is a fully awakened one. He is endowed with wisdom and practice, etc., etc. Right? And each of these names has a different meaning. Those names are effectively like virtues, good qualities that he had. And so by chanting those names, which are kind of titles of the Buddha's virtues, you're keeping him in mind, and you're keeping those good qualities in mind. And again, that was originally a kind of mindfulness as a recollection. In Chinese Buddhism, of course, it gets narrowed down to chanting the Buddha's name like a mantra, and then effectively it's smaller and it's shorter. But when you make your object of focus smaller, you can actually develop greater focus on it. If you just have something really small and pinpoint, just like the name of the Buddha, for example, Amitofo, Amitofo, you can get really focused with a very short, just Amitofo, 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 Amitofo. If you've got like a longer one, then the mind doesn't have that much focus because the mind is more diffuse on a bigger object. So all the ones that you've mentioned here, yes, they might begin with mindfulness, but when that gets deeper and deeper, they can lead to these different jhanas. Though there are some different teachings that kind of go through and do some pretty heavy technical work to say, oh, this particular kind of practice will only lead to first jhana at most, or second jhana, or this particular practice, meditation practice, can lead all the way up to the fourth jhana. Now, so like one example of that is in the Theravadan school, for example, if I recall correctly, they only believe that mindfulness of the body can lead to the first jhana and no further. They also often correspond, I hope I've remembered this correctly, the four immeasurable minds, so loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. They correspond those to the four jhanas. So they say the first one will only lead to the first jhana, the second one can lead to the second jhana, the third one to the third, and then equanimity can lead to the fourth. Now, often the reason why they say this, so you might, if you're reading some literature, you might see these kinds of explanations where they line up. But I want to warn you, some of those matching up things, there's a lot of stuff, material for kind of slightly later Buddhist teachings that talk about different technical aspects of Buddhism. People really like to portray these things as though it's just like, oh, these teachings are just from the direct experience of meditators. Some of it is, for sure. Some of it definitely isn't, and some of it comes from very specific and very detailed doctrinal reasons why they don't think that should happen or why they think something else should happen. So don't always just buy that as though that's like absolute gospel. And there are still different debates about like how far different techniques, how far into samadhi or dhyana they can get you. Okay, I hope that's kind of answered your question there, Hanuman, and it's a very good question. I see we've got another question from Alexander. Sorry, this is a bit off topic. Okay, well, we'll see. But this brought something to mind. Is the meditation practice discussed in the Wu Liang Shou for Jing practiced in any contemporary traditions in Taiwan? Okay, so this is the Sutra on the Buddha of Infinite Life, so the Amitayus Sutra. Yes, it is. So this is a sutra that it's also sometimes just called the Contemplation or the Visualization Sutra. And it goes through many different stages. It's basically like a detailed step-by-step guide to visualizing the Pure Land, and specifically visualizing Amitayus Buddha, Amitabha Buddha, just different names, same Buddha, for that practice. If you like visualization stuff, and particularly if you like Pure Land visualization practices, definitely check out this text, because it's really nice step-by-step material, and like you could follow it answer your question. Yeah, it's totally practiced in contemporary traditions in Taiwan. Not everyone does it because it's a bit complicated because there's many steps. You can do all the steps and really develop that. You're constructing a visualization, and for more complex visualizations, you do have to construct them, right? You need to, for example, it goes from like the ground of the Pure Land, and then visualizing the Buddha, and then the two bodhisattvas beside the Buddha. You're visualizing like all the different trees and the items in the Pure Land. When you want to then focus on visualizing just the Buddha himself, how do you build it up? From his eyes and the mark between his eyebrows, the face, down through the rest of the body. If you've done this kind of visualization stuff, it's like visualizing like a mandala. You have to build it. You literally have to build it bit by bit. And in order to keep it like really clear, you have to kind of go back and paint all the little bits of the picture, and then by the time you're finished, other bits will be murky, and you go back and you repaint them, and over you're building and constructing that. If you're into that, it's a very excellent teaching in there. And also, back to the question, I noticed some development perhaps of aspects of the four immeasurables through Neon 4, combining it with mindfulness of the body. Okay, that sounds interesting. And then another question from Hanuman. Speaking of the Theravada matching of dhyana states to methods, what is your opinion on Richard Gombrich's claim that the practice of metta or karuna can lead to nirvana? Okay, this is a very good question. And it's a good claim by Professor Gombrich. I think there's a lot in his argument. And this is another, so if you look at Theravadan, now remember, Theravada teachings does not equal sutta teachings. A lot of people think, Theravada Buddhism is the earliest Buddhism. It's just what the Buddha taught. No, look at the word Theravada, the teachings of the elders. It literally means that after the Buddha's time, many hundreds of years, different teachers are then explaining the Buddha's teachings, and this includes a lot of the Abhidhamma material. A lot of Abhidhamma material is a lot of psychology in there, but it's not necessarily empirical psychology. A lot of it is, there's different, because of this doctrine and that doctrine and some other doctrine, therefore we can come to the conclusion that such and such. And one of his arguments is that as Theravadan thought developed, they basically said so metta and karuna, those types of things are then put in the samadhi category, and samadhi is not enough for liberation. You need samadhi, and you also need prajna. You need calm, and you need insight, wisdom. Right? We all know standard Buddhism. Okay, very standard Buddhism. But assigning that loving kindness and compassion purely to the samadhi aspect, the Buddha didn't necessarily say that himself. That kind of becomes a bit of a later development. So I think there's quite a bit in his argument, and it's definitely worth looking at. And I think one of the interesting things is, okay, even like in Mahayana Buddhism, Mahayana, after early Mahayana, like mid-period Mahayana and later, we see really heavy emphasis. You need compassion, which means loving kindness and compassion, maitri, karuna, and you also need wisdom. But these two also inform each other as well. So you also have this distinction. It's sort of like loving kindness and compassion is not enough. You also need the wisdom. But these totally complement each other as well. So the Theravada tradition maybe plays down the role of loving kindness. The Mahayana lifts it up, but they've already gone through that process of separating out wisdom and loving kindness, compassion into two different categories. And this is the essential one. The wisdom is the essential one for liberation. Whatever the case, even if you think that loving kindness is not enough for liberation, practice it anyway, because it's good for ourselves and for others. Okay, where were we? back to the PowerPoint. Okay, time is moving on, but good questions, everyone. Okay, factors of dhyana. So we're just talking about, these different states and different forms of existence. So what are the basic factors? So each of the dhyanas has different mental qualities. The first dhyana has 5. They are what's often translated as applied thought and sustained thought, joy, happiness, and one-pointedness. So one-pointedness just means mind on one thing. Mind on one thing. Literally one-pointedness. Eka agrata. So eka meaning one, agra means like a point, like a peak. Ta is abstract. One-pointedness of mind. Your mind is focused on one thing. Now these first 2 terms are there's a lot of different translations. They are vitarka and vichara. And one of the issues in particular is with the term vitarka, because vitarka in other contexts can mean like logic and reasoning. Here it probably means, and it can also have a sense of like what we might call discursive thought when we think with words. Right, when we think with words and language as thinking. And then the term vichara, chara means to go around something. So when you put the 2 together, I think this kind of applied thought and sustained thought is a good way of looking at it. So applied thought means normally our minds are scattered and bouncing all around the place. And then we want to focus it on this thing. So we apply the mind to that thing. Of course, when we apply it, it might wander off. You apply it and it wanders off. In that case, it's a bit like mindfulness, actually. And then once we've applied it there, you also need to sustain it. You need to maintain it and hold it there as well, right? So it's not enough. One thing, you need to direct the mind to the object, and you also need to hold it on the object. And both of these have this aspect of being like discursive. So when you're meditating, right? Remember when we did our mindfulness meditation? So you're sitting there meditating, and I say, like, think to yourself, mindfully breathing in, mindfully breathing out. So when we're thinking that little sentence, it's got words and language, so it's discursive thought, vitarka. And it's also then helping to direct the mind. That thought helps to direct the mind to the breath. As opposed to if I said something like, Big Mac and a Coke, right? That's also discursive thought, but it makes my mind not focus. It makes my mind go off to something else, right? So applied thought and sustained thought. There is still that kind of thought even in this first dhyana. Joy and happiness. Now, there's one very famous Buddhist book which then talks about and says like, oh, you need to develop joy and happiness to get into the first dhyana. But I really don't think it's like that at all. What you get is, and in the typical descriptions of this state is, the practitioner abandons sensory desire and the 5 hindrances, which we'll get to on the next slide. They are applying their mind and sustaining their mind on the object, right? So applied thought, sustained thought, one-pointedness. And joy and happiness is like a result of that. So kind of the applied thought and the sustained thought, which together kind of bring about this one-pointedness, that's kind of what you're doing, right? So when you're meditating, this is what you need to do. You need to apply the mind, maintain it, and focus it on the object. The joy and happiness are then kind of a result that you get from that. It's not something that you sit there and go, happy, happy, joy, joy. I'm so happy, I'm so happy, I'm so happy. And because then you've got happiness and joy, therefore you enter jhana, right? This happiness and joy is not the form that we get from sensory desire. It's not the joy from having a nice, delicious smoothie on a hot afternoon. Okay. Now, so in this first jhana, you're focusing on one thing. You've got these states. And as it deepens, second jhana, that applied thought and sustained thought are gone. Now, it doesn't mean that you've still got the one-pointedness. It just means that by that stage, the mind is you barely even need to maintain it there. It's like it's already firmly placed. You do not need to constantly be pushing the mind onto the topic or bringing it back onto the topic. It's already there. Joy and happiness remain, they deepen, and the one-pointedness. Then in the third jhana, no joy, only happiness and one-pointedness. Now, we need to maybe just a little bit of note about these two terms, joy and happiness. So the first one, priti, the second one, sukha. Sometimes it's described that the joy, the term we're using, joy, is kind of it's like an overwhelming, blissful kind of feeling that occurs, kind of permeates the whole body and mind. And it's kind of like a wave crashing over you. And the happiness is then like after the wave is gone, but you're still soaking wet. So, or another metaphor that's used is like striking a bell. When you first hit the bell, you get the big bong. That's the joy. It's quite sudden and intense. But then after that, there's the constant of the bell as it continues. So, what often happens is early on here, when we first get that kind of joy, that overwhelming feeling, it's really possible that if it's kind of new to you, that it will knock us off track. It's like, whoa, what was this feel? Oh, this feels, hey. Once we start thinking that, of course, we're no longer focused and we're going to lose our dhyana. And so by this stage, the meditator knows that this joy can actually be almost a little bit disruptive. It's very intense. And so it evens out and you just end up with this really ongoing, deep, pervading happiness, but without the kind of intense wave that this joy provides. And then by the fourth dhyana, even that happiness is abandoned, basically on the grounds that happiness is a potential object of desire. People can definitely cling to that. They can cling to that joy and that happiness. So by the fourth dhyana, even that's gone, one-pointedness is left, and a kind of equanimity. Perfect kind of clarity and equanimity. And because that happiness is no longer said to be there, it's even more ideal to become a launching point then for insight. Now, just one other note. Now, so these states do have this joy and happiness. Now, some people who I find are very strange in their reasoning say, oh, because meditation has this joy and happiness, you can get attached to it. It's definitely true. It's possible to get quite attached to these kinds of states. And therefore, you kind of shouldn't meditate because you'll just get attached to it. This is really silly. Yeah, there is this happiness and joy, but to get here, you have to abandon regular coarse sensory types of happiness and joy. And it's a totally recognized Buddhist practice that you then can use the happiness and joy of that, even the first jhana or second jhana, to abandon earlier forms. There's the classic story of the Buddha's half-brother, Nanda, who was kind of a bit of a playboy when he was a young man. He's a bit of a playboy. He liked all sorts of sensory pleasures, shall we say. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And so the Buddha kind of lured him into the monastic lifestyle, saying that if you practice meditation, you can have even higher types of divine joy and divine happiness, which is even better than the kind of sensory happiness that you have as a princely playboy. So he thought, well, that sounds good. And so he abandoned the lay life and practiced meditation to get that kind of joy. Other monks used to make fun of him, but in the end, he also realized that even that kind of joy he needed to overcome. So using a kind of a higher form of happiness to abandon a lower form of happiness is a totally recognized practice. But once you get to the highest point of that, you also have to recognize that even higher forms of happiness are themselves impermanent and subject to change, and we need to have an attitude of equanimity towards them. And then we can even abandon those. So these states go through ever more subtle and more refined states, up into, deeper into these dhyanas. Now again, for most of us, this is kind of like, interesting information about it. How close are we even to this first dhyana? It's a very good question, right? So let's just get into what we kind of need to do there for dhyana. Maybe let me flip back. Maybe there's a question popping out at this point. The time is getting on as usual. Okay. From Hanuman, thank you. Find your explanations very reasonable and agreeable. Okay, well, thank you. Sometimes things can be reasonable and agreeable, but still be wrong. Reasonable, maybe not so bad. Don't buy what I'm saying just because it's agreeable. Okay, I know that's kind of not what you mean, but I think you also know what I mean. Okay, and a question from Eric. Question, so the joy and happiness that are not sensual feeling as we know it, since there's an abandonment of the senses in the first stage. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And that's what I'm just about to get into now, Eric. So just stay with me, my friend. Okay, so, what do we need to do to get here? I'm kind of speeding this up. Time is short. There are 5 obstructions to dhyana: sensual desire, sensual aversion, dullness and heaviness, agitation, excitement, and doubt. Now, when we look at the oldest and the most classic kinds of explanation of going from regular state of mind to entering into the first dhyana, they basically are phrased something like this. Excuse me. So the meditator, they go into the forest or a cave or wherever, they sit down, legs crossed, body upright, they establish their mindfulness in front of them. It's just a stock standard expression. They abandon sensory desire and they forsake the 5 hindrances, and on doing so, with applied thought and sustained thought, with joy and happiness, they achieve the state of one-pointedness of mind, which is the first dhyana. So they're abandoning sensual desire and they're abandoning the 5 hindrances. Now, it's worth kind of noting that the first of the 5 hindrances is basically just sensual desire. So kind of like there's a bit of repetition there, but I think the key point is that that's the biggest obstacle, sensual desire. When our mind and our senses are chasing after objects, right? When we are engaged in pigging out on yummy food or indulging and listening to music because it sounds very beautiful and we feel good. All these things are effectively hindrances to meditation. Now later on in Buddhism there was a really big discussion. Does it mean that when you're in the first dhyana that kind of your 5 external senses effectively stop working, or are they still functioning? That's quite a bit of a debate. Many Abhidharma schools say they effectively stop working. When you're in the first dhyana, you cannot see or hear or smell or taste or touch things. All those perceptions are gone. Personally, I'm inclined to think no, not quite. But I don't want to get into the reasons why. The key thing isn't so much that you can't see or hear or smell or taste or touch, but you are not following or chasing after the sensory pleasures that come through these things. I mean, the whole of the monastic lifestyle, well, a lot of the monastic lifestyle is just dealing with that, for example, right? Simple lifestyle. It's socially isolated. You're avoiding all those kinds of temptations. So sensual desire is a big obstacle. And the reverse of that, or the kind of the complement of that, it's not the opposite, is sensual aversion. So both of these, of course, just through the senses, when we are chasing after pleasant things or we are running away from unpleasant things, the mind cannot be still. The mind is either moving towards or moving away, right? So when the mind's running after or running away, it cannot be calm and focused and stable. Just as simple as that. Getting rid of these 2, not enough. We've got 2 other big ones which are also kind of complementary. One is dullness and heaviness. when, imagine you've just stuffed yourself full of too much food, and then, half an hour later, an hour later, you are back in the meditation hall. First meditation session after lunch, usually the worst for most people, heavy and dull. That's that kind of like meditation. When your body's, just all the like the blood energy goes down here, the changes in blood sugar levels, all those kinds of things. Of course, this is like a modern way of partially explaining why we have it. But you'll know when you've got that state of mind, you also can't meditate. You might be very kind of like calm, relaxed, but meditative state is clear. It's not dull. So dullness and heaviness is also something we need to deal with, and there are different techniques for dealing with that. Big ones like getting enough sleep, not overeating. Meditate in places that are like not too dark. If you're like in a dark and very cramped place, it makes us kind of want to curl up and go to sleep. Or if it's too hot or too cold. Open your eyes, sit up straight, get fresh air. Be in a more open space will help us to keep awake and alert. And then the flip side is agitation and excitement, where the mind is like too active, like, oh, thinking about this and da-da-da-da-da. So like the overly stimulated mind, it is a little bit different to sensual desire and aversion. It's kind of like just the mind's just like da-da-da-da-da, overly stimulated, lots of thoughts, thinking about this and this and this and this and this. If like you've worked, like done a lot of work that day, and you come home and try to meditate, and you're thinking about all those things you've got to do, it's not desire, right? It's not aversion, but it's just too much thinking, too much on your mind where you can't then focus. And again, techniques to calm down, similar a bit to getting rid of dullness and heaviness. Sleep and food are two big factors, but just not overworking ourselves and not cramming so much stuff into our heads that we can't focus at all. The last one, doubt. Whoop. Oh, hello. Doubt isn't just doubt in general. It refers specifically to doubt with regard to the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the big one, of course, doubt with respect to the techniques that we're learning. And that might also be related to doubt within the teacher. So maybe you've learned a teaching instruction from a certain person, but for various reasons you have some misgivings about that person. Well, keep in mind that we rely on the teaching, not on the teacher. But having confidence in a teaching is a big thing. If you're using some technique and you just think like, I just don't think this technique will work, it probably won't, because we're going into that with that thought, it's not going to work. We'll find a way to make sure that it doesn't work. The flip side, of course, is having confidence in the teachings that we have. Now, you don't want blind faith, but it is good to, if we're learning a particular technique, learn from people that have had success with it, see the tradition of that technique, and then we can be a bit inspired by it and see like, wow, these techniques, even something like breath meditation. The Buddha had hundreds or maybe thousands of disciples who used this technique and attained liberation. Throughout 2,500 years, there have been countless practitioners that have used just the breath as a powerful foundation for their teaching, and it's worked for them. And probably some of these people had far worse different practice conditions than I ever do. So if it worked for them, it can definitely work for me too. So overcoming doubt may be a factor as well, and having a bit of confidence and a bit of like inspiration for the specific teachings that we are practicing, and in a broader sense for the immediate tradition that we're learning from. Okay, oh wow, that's about it for today. We're already like almost 10 past 10. As always, a lot of material to cover. Let me pop back here and see any questions here. So from Alexander, cut out the rice and the meditation improves. Yeah, sure. Like as well as going with tea rather than coffee. So, food and drink can be big factors in getting our body and mind in that right state. And you will have to experiment for yourself and pay attention, when you're having a good session. Reflect on what your lifestyle's been like in the last maybe couple of immediately beforehand, the last immediate day or two or even week. When you're having a bad session, also reflect, and then you start to say, if I behave in a certain way, if I binge watch 20 hours of Netflix before I meditate, yes, I can't focus. Surprise, surprise, right? So overdose of sensory stimulation. If I have just, eaten a giant double, triple combo meal, I feel dull and sleepy. Yeah, okay, well, there we can see the reason why. And by paying attention, we can see the changes that we need to make in our lifestyle, and then we can see that relationship between lifestyle / ethics. I always say, when we talk about ethics or shila, it's not just precepts, it's lifestyle, and then how that relates in turn to then meditation. Okay, wow, time is getting on. I think I'm gonna just skip the stretches. Okay, if you want to stretch, jump up now and stretch, because I'm just gonna move back there and just sit on my cushion, and we're gonna do our meditation session. Okay, boom. Okay, I'm gonna drop this camera down a bit. I hope that kind of works. Okay. Okie dokie, everyone. So get comfy. I hope that's not too bad for you if you've been sitting there all that time and you haven't got up to stretch. You can just do some stretch in place, to stretch sideways. Always good to stretch up like this and open up your chest. Particularly if you've been sitting for a long time, it's easy to hunch, and then your chest gets constructed and so forth. So stretch up like this, open up your shoulders, open up your head and neck and chest, and it's good. These techniques, just this kind of posture, or posture like this, something like this, it's invigorating. The physiological changes will produce some, and it will lift your spirits, right? This is why this is such a good pose of victory, goodness, there's a kind of physiological, psychological connection between them. Okay, Okay, time is short, I'm sorry today. Talking about meditation, not practicing meditation, not ideal, is it? But we can have a little session anyway. So adjust your posture, make sure you're upright and alert but relaxed. Begin with a few deep full breaths. Ease into your posture. Feel your whole body. Mindfully breathing in and mindfully breathing out, and we can use just that sentence, those words, as our kind of applied thought, and then apply our awareness to the breath. Mindfully mindfully breathing in and mindfully breathing out. The mind wanders or is distracted internally or externally, and just bring it back to the breath. Mindfully breathing in a long breath. Mindfully breathing out a long breath. Mindfully breathing in, aware of the body. Mindfully breathing out, aware of the body. Mindfully breathing in, relaxing the body. Mindfully breathing out, relaxing the body. Nice deep full breath in. Slowly exhaling all the way out. Gently rock your upper body side to side, going from passive state back to activity. Roll your shoulders, stretch up, breathing in and breathing out with your arms down. Warm up the palms of the hands, covering the eyes, massaging around the eye sockets, and the forehead, temples, cheeks, down your chin, the face, on your earlobes. This is good if you've got dullness when you're meditating, massaging your ears and your earlobes, around your eyes. Those vital pressure points can be a very good way to kind of brighten up, freshen up, feel a bit better. You can breathe in, we can stretch forward over the left leg, over the right leg, back to the middle, come up, stretching back. Okay, slowly unfold your legs, and if you need to, you can massage the legs, you can twist at your ankles, get your feeling back there, the same on the other side. Okay, short session today, I know. Okay, I'm just going to come forward. Hopefully that's the right height. Okay, looks about right. So that about wraps up our last session here for today. We just got a couple of minutes left, so if you do have any just questions at the end and want to put them out there, just go for it. It's always there's always time. Or if you just want to have anything you want to share with everyone else who's joining us today. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Lots of questions, and I think all like really good questions. See, some of you guys have done some pretty serious research and reading, which is always really cool to see as well. Because this topic of meditation and Buddhism is it's a huge topic. Just the different texts and traditions, and then our modern understanding and modern, some modern scholarship and practices do provide us with different angles and different questions that we want to ask. And another really important factor is in the present time, doing empirical studies on meditation and seeing what the results are. But one key thing is, like I said, meditation, just this English word meditation, it's really broad, and it's important to see there's lots of different techniques, and they do have differences, not just in how they're practiced, how they affect us, and what specific techniques we might need to help us at any given time in the day or any given time in our lives. That can always change. I think a good skillful meditator, you might have a particular technique, one, maybe two or even three techniques that are your go-to techniques. But I think you also need to have a range of more techniques that you might find you use for specific situations. So like for myself, I find breath meditation is one of my go-to techniques. Mindfulness of the Buddha, so reciting the Buddha's name, another go-to technique. And loving kindness and compassion. And then I use those sometimes in different contexts and different situations. Loving kindness and compassion I find works really well when I'm around a lot of people. there's lots of people. So, okay, these people can all be the object of that meditation technique. Whereas if I'm by myself, maybe mindfulness of the breath is calmer, it's easier to relax, for example. So don't be afraid to look at some different techniques, but I don't recommend having only one practice, and I don't recommend knowing 150 different practices that we've only practiced for a week each. That won't help too much either. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you all for your thank yous. We still have one last little thing to do, which is our dedication of merit. So let's get ready and wrap it up with that, shall we? Okay. I go to the Buddha for refuge, vowing that all sentient beings shall realize the great path and aspire to the supreme state of mind. I go to the Dharma for refuge, vowing that all sentient beings shall deeply enter the collection of teachings and attain wisdom like the ocean. I go to the Sangha for refuge, vowing that all sentient beings shall unite and lead the community in harmony without any hindrance. Okay, everyone, been great seeing you again. We'll be back next week for our last class in this series on Buddhist meditation. And just to let you know now, probably after that, we might have a bit of a longer break before we start the next course here at Bodhi Tree, because I'm going to be super busy. So, but I'll let you know, of course, when we'll be starting back up. So next week, we've still got one more class, okay? So I hope to see you all then. And in the meantime, take care, stay safe, look after those around you, and look after your own heart and mind. Okay, everyone, take care. I'll see you soon.